Every YouTube video exists twice. The first version is the one you watch, the polished one. The one with the music, the visuals, the pacing, where every point feels intentional and every conclusion feels inevitable. But before any of that, there's another version. The one that never gets uploaded. It's made of unfinished notes, late night questions, rabbit holes that lead nowhere, ideas that get abandoned halfway through, and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tiny decisions that slowly transform a passing thought into something worth sharing. That's the version you never see. You see, nearly 1 year ago, I uploaded my very first video to this channel. At the time, I had no idea where any of this would lead. I didn't know what kinds of stories I'd end up telling, what ideas I'd become obsessed with, or whether anyone would even care enough to watch. Since then, they still kind of don't, but this channel has grown into something I couldn't have imagined. Not just a collection of videos, but a collection of thought experiments exploring the ideas hidden beneath the media we consume. Normally, this is where I'd ask you to look behind the veil of a film, or a game, or a piece of technology. But today, the thing behind the veil is the channel itself. See, this isn't going to be a tutorial. I'm not here to teach you the correct way to edit videos because honestly, I don't think there is one. Everything you're about to see is the result of habits I've developed over the past year, completely self-taught, probably a little unconventional, and almost certainly not the most effective way to do any of it. But it works for me. More importantly, I don't think editing is actually the interesting part. For me it is, but the interesting part is what happens long before the timeline ever opens. How does a random thought become a thesis? How does a question become an argument? How does the argument eventually become a finished video? To answer that, we're going to follow the creation of one of my essays from the very beginning. Not from the first sentence of the script, but from the very first moment an idea refuses to leave me alone. Welcome to A Peek Behind the Veil. Now, if you've watched more than a few of my videos, you've probably noticed they don't exactly stay in one lane. One video's about the Matrix, the next is found footage horror, the next is kaiju, then digital ownership, then alien. On the surface, none of these topics really belong together. But to me, they're all asking the same question. You see, the name The Veiled Icon actually has two meanings. The first one is probably the more obvious one. Every piece of media becomes an icon in some way. A film, a character, a game, a moment in pop culture. But over time, we tend to remember the icon more than the idea behind it. My goal has never been to explain movies, review games, or tell you whether something is good or bad. It's to pull back that veil. Ask what fears, philosophies, cultural shifts, or human experiences are hiding underneath the things we've been familiar with. But there's another meaning. If you've ever looked at a desktop on your computer, every little icon represents something much larger than the tiny picture you're actually seeing. Click on that icon and it opens an entire application. Thousands of lines of code, years of development. An entire system hidden behind a simple image. In a lot of ways, this channel is that icon. Every video you watch is a small window into a much larger collection of interests, questions, rabbit holes, and ideas that occupy far more of my life than I could ever fit in a single upload. You're not watching the whole system, you're interacting with a tiny representation of it. And maybe that's the most appropriate definition of a veil. Not something that hides truth, but something that only reveals enough for you to understand what's underneath. I jokingly call this philosophy behind all of this academic nihilism. Taking subjects that most people see as entertainment and treating them like they're worthy of genuine curiosity. Not because they contain absolute answers, but because they often ask questions that are more interesting than the answers themselves. Ironically, YouTube wasn't even the reason I started doing this. By day, I work as a marketing director for a safety systems manufacturer, and content creation is already a huge part of my job. Writing, editing, producing videos, content, organizing information, communicating ideas, those are all skills I use professionally every single day. Starting this channel gave me an excuse to keep practicing those skills on projects I was genuinely passionate about. But more importantly, the ideas already existed. Even if I never uploaded a single video, I'd still be reading interviews, watching documentaries, connecting seemingly unrelated topics, and disappearing down research rabbit holes simply because something caught my attention. I don't do research for YouTube videos. The YouTube videos are how I give shape to research I was already doing. They're my way of taking a collection of disconnected thoughts and organizing them into something another person can follow. Every one of these videos follows exactly that path. Not because I planned it that way, but because every single one of them started with the same thing. A single question that refuses to leave me alone. So, where do those questions actually come from? So, where do those questions actually come from? For this video, we're going to use one of my upcoming essays as an example. Now, like most ideas, it doesn't begin with a notebook or a script or even an intention to make a YouTube video. It just starts with something. For instance, me rewatching the Evangelion Rebuild films. You see, my oldest was finally at the right age where I could expose them to Evangelion through the Rebuild films, and as we got further into the series, one character kept pulling my attention away from everything else. Mari. Not because she was my favorite character, not because I disliked her, but because something about her felt off. She wasn't just different from the original cast, she felt different from everyone else in the Rebuild films too. Almost like she was operating under an entirely different set of rules. And at first, that's all it was, a feeling. One of those tiny observations that most people would probably acknowledge for a second before moving on. I didn't, because that's how mytism works, and that's where my brain gets stuck. If something doesn't quite make sense, I have an incredibly difficult time just letting it go. I replay scenes, think through different possibilities while I'm driving, while I'm working, while I'm trying to fall asleep. Not because I'm looking for a YouTube video, but because I genuinely want to understand it. This is probably where the tism really comes into play. I've always had a tendency to latch onto ideas that don't quite fit together and keep pulling on that thread until I either understand why or completely exhaust every possibility I can think of. And the funny thing is, most of those rabbit holes never become videos. In fact, I'd say the overwhelming majority of them don't. Sometimes I reach a satisfying answer. Sometimes I realize there wasn't much there to begin with. Sometimes I simply lose interest and move on to something else. The research wasn't wasted, it satisfied my curiosity, and that was enough. That's something I think is worth pointing out. I don't sit around trying to invent YouTube ideas. I chase ideas because I'm curious. The videos are just one of the things that survives the process. Every now and again, though, a question starts getting bigger instead of smaller. The more you look into it, the more pieces begin to fall into place. The idea stops feeling like an interesting observation and starts feeling like an argument. And that's usually the moment I realize there might actually be a video here, because curiosity eventually becomes investigation. Now, at this point, I'm still not making a YouTube video. I'm trying to answer a question, and there's an important difference. An observation isn't enough to build a video on. Saying Mari feels out of place is an observation. It might even be a correct observation, but it doesn't actually say anything. It's just the starting point. A thesis, on the other hand, is an argument. It's an attempt to explain why that observation exists in the first place. That's the stage I spend most of the time in, not writing, thinking. I'll rewatch scenes, not because I forgot what happened, but because I'm looking at them differently every time. I'll start reading interviews with creators, looking through production notes, comparing earlier versions of the story, then challenging my own conclusions against everything I find. If an interview completely dismantles the direction I thought I was heading, good. I'd rather find out now than build an hour-long video around an idea that doesn't hold up. One thing I try very hard to avoid is falling in love with my first conclusion, because the first explanation that makes sense isn't always the best explanation. Sometimes I'll spend days convinced I'm into something, only to find one piece of information that completely changes how I look at the entire subject. That's not frustrating, it's actually exciting. It means I learned something. The goal should never be to prove that you're right. The goal is to understand the subject a little better than you did yesterday. And eventually, after enough reading, enough rewatching, and enough questions, a pattern starts to emerge. The scattered pieces begin fitting together. Questions start answering other questions, and somewhere in all of that, the actual thesis reveals itself. Not because I decided what I wanted to say, but because the evidence slowly pointed me there. Once that happens, everything becomes easier. The structure, the pacing, the examples, even the jokes. Because now I no longer am trying to figure out what the video is about. I'm trying to figure out how to communicate an idea I already understand. And once you know what you're saying, you can actually finally start figuring out how to say it. Now, with that structure in place, the real writing begins. At least, that's what it looks like from the outside. In reality, writing one of these videos isn't a straight line from first sentence to the last. It's more like sculpting. It's a constant cycle of building, refreshing, breaking, and then rebuilding. Every pass adds another layer. The first draft is usually just bullet points trying to get ideas onto a page. The second is fleshing those out and making sure the argument actually flows. Then I start thinking about how the audience is going to experience it. Where does the pacing need to slow down? Where does it need a joke before things get dense? Where's the right place for a callback to something I mentioned earlier? Would this point land harder if I showed a clip instead of just describing it? And as I'm writing, I'm already editing, not in Premiere, but in my head. I can usually picture the scenes while I'm typing it. I already know what clips I want to use, what graphics I probably have to make, where a meme can relieve some tension before jumping back into the analysis, when I want to transition or linger just for a second longer. Sometimes I'll even stop writing entirely because an edit pops into my head and I don't want to lose it. So I'll make a note, then jump back into the script. By the time I reach the end, the script isn't just dialogue anymore, it's almost a blueprint for the finished video. The visuals aren't written in every line, but I already know where most of them belong. That's why I don't like recording voiceover until the script is pretty much completely finished. I've noticed some creators record as they write, and there's nothing wrong with that. It just doesn't particularly fit well for me. I prefer sitting down and recording a narration in one sitting. That way the energy stays consistent, the pacing stays consistent, and I'm not constantly re-recording lines because I decided to change something halfway through writing. And once the script feels finished, the writing stops for the first time. Then the video finally gets a voice. With the script finally locked in, it's time to record. This is probably one of the least exciting parts to watch, but one of the most important parts to get right. For me, the narration is the backbone of the entire video. Everything else will build around it. The visuals, the music, the pacing, the edits, even the jokes. They're all there to support the story the narration is telling. That's why I prefer recording the entire script in a single sitting whenever I can. Not because it's faster, honestly it usually isn't, but because it keeps everything consistent. The tone stays the same, the pacing, the energy. If I record half the script one day and finish the rest a week later, there's a surprisingly good chance I'm gonna sound like two different people. Maybe I'm more tired, maybe I've had more coffee, maybe I'm getting over a cold, maybe I'm just in a different mood. Most people probably wouldn't consciously notice these differences, but they'd feel them. And there's one thing I've learned in making these videos is that people notice inconsistency long before they know why something feels off. That's another reason why I spend so much time in the script beforehand, so that by the time I hit record, I don't want to be rewriting paragraphs, I don't want to be deciding whether a joke works, I don't want to be changing the order of the chapters. I want to focus on one thing, the performance. Because that's really what the narration is. Even though you're only hearing my voice, I'm still performing. Every pause, emphasis, sarcastic remark, even dramatic beat, they're all intentional. Sometimes I'll do multiple takes of a single sentence, not because I said it incorrectly, but because it didn't feel right. Maybe the rhythm was off, maybe I emphasized the wrong word, maybe the joke landed a little too flat. Those tiny details matter more than people realize. Eventually, though, there's moments where the script stops being words on a page and starts sounding like an actual conversation. Once that narration is finished, everything changes. The project finally stops feeling like a document and starts feeling like a video, because now the invisible work finally has something you can see. With the narration finished, I finally open the editor. The very first thing that goes into the timeline is the voiceover. Everything else builds around it. But before I start dragging in movie clips and making graphics, there's another piece of the puzzle that has become a much bigger part of the videos over the past year: the music. For a long time, I relied mostly on royalty-free soundtracks, but more recently I've started producing the music for the videos myself. Music has always been a hobby of mine. Long before YouTube, I've spent years playing instruments, doing vocals, and learning music production simply because I enjoyed it. On top of that, my wife is a classically trained concert pianist and a music teacher, so music has always been a big part of our lives. Between the two of us, I have an incredible resource of bouncing around ideas, talking through arrangements, and figuring out what a piece needs to accomplish emotionally. Once the narration is finished, I start thinking about each chapter almost like it's its own short film. What should this section feel like? Should it create tension, curiosity, nostalgia, unease? Should it slowly build or immediately grab your attention? I'll begin writing and arranging music specifically for that section because the soundtrack isn't there to fill the silence, it's there to shape the experience. Every chapter gets its own identity while still belonging to the larger video. And once the music starts coming together, it changes the way I edit. A transition might linger a little longer because the music needs room to breathe. A visual reveal might happen exactly on a musical swell. Sometimes I'll change the music to better support an edit. Oftentimes I'll change an edit because the music communicates the moment better than I could originally imagined. They develop together. Neither one is really finished until the other is. Only then do I start building everything else around the narration. This is the stage most people probably imagine when they think about making YouTube videos. Finding clips, creating graphics, animating text, building tension, but honestly, the software itself isn't the most important part. Because it really doesn't matter whether you're using Premiere, DaVinci Resolve, CapCut, or something else. Those are just tools. Editing isn't really about the software, it's about communication. Every decision is trying to answer the same question. How do I make this idea easier to understand? Sometimes that's showing exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's cutting away to a joke because the audience has been absorbing heavy information for 5 minutes straight and needs a chance to breathe. Sometimes the best edit is no edit at all. Just letting an idea sit with the audience for a moment before moving on. Those are the things I spend most of my time thinking about. Not flashy transitions or complicated effects, but clarity, pacing, rhythm, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to make the audience laugh, and when to let them think. I should also say none of this is meant to be the way to edit. I did study some editing classes because of my work, but for the most part, everything I know has been pieced together through years of trial and error, watching creators I admire, making mistakes, and gradually finding a workflow that makes sense to me. It's probably inefficient, it's probably not how professional editors would approach the projects, but after a year or so of making these videos specifically, it's become my process. And somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like I was assembling pieces and started feeling like I was uncovering something that had been there all along. Eventually, the videos started feeling finished, but that's usually the moment I remind myself it isn't finished yet. Now, by this point, the whole video is essentially finished, or at least I think it is. There's usually one last phase before it ever reaches YouTube, and that's the phase that taught me that finished is a very relative term. YouTube is the final quality control check, where I find the problems I somehow missed after staring at the same timeline for days. Maybe a piece of footage gets blocked. Maybe a copyright claim appears where I wasn't expecting one. Maybe YouTube's compression makes a scene darker than it looked in the editor. Maybe I notice a typo. Maybe I hear an awkward audio transition that somehow survived every previous watch. I'll fix it, upload again, check it again, repeat until I'm finally comfortable with pressing publish. And through all of this, there's one thing I try to remind myself of. None of what you see is the process. It's just my process. Yours might look completely different. Maybe you're storyboarding everything. Maybe you're improvising. Maybe you write on paper. Maybe you record before you even have a script. None of these approaches are inherently right or wrong. At the end of the day, the best workflow is the one that helps you take the ideas out of your head and put them into the world. Everything else is just a personal preference. Before I finally hit publish, there's one last tradition I keep. If you've ever read the description of my videos, you may have noticed they sounded a little different. That's because I'm a huge fan of Frankie McDonald. His excitement is infectious, his optimism is genuine, and there's something incredibly charming about the way he writes. I write almost all of my video descriptions in a style inspired by Frankie's cadence. It's completely unnecessary, most people probably never notice it, but it makes me smile every time I do. Then I publish. And for a few moments, there's nothing left to change. The progress bar finishes, the video goes live. I'll probably refresh the page a couple more times than I'd like to admit, see if everything is working correctly, maybe glance at the analytics, maybe refresh one more time, okay, maybe a few more times. And then something interesting happens. The project that has been occupying my thoughts for weeks is suddenly over. You'd think that's where the process ends, but it never really does. Because somewhere along the way, usually long before the video's even finished, another question has already started nagging me. Another rabbit hole has already opened. Another notebook page was already filling with scattered thoughts. So I'll close the editor, open a fresh document, and begin all over again. Because that's the funny thing about curiosity. It doesn't wait for you to finish your last idea before giving you the next one. Now, after making videos for the better part of a year, I've learned quite a bit. Not really about the algorithm or how to hack YouTube. Honestly, I'm probably the wrong person to ask any of that. But I've learned a few things about creating. The first is that curiosity is infinitely more valuable than chasing trends. Trends eventually disappear. Curiosity doesn't. If you're genuinely fascinated by something, you'll naturally ask better questions, dig a little deeper, and probably make something more interesting than if you were simply trying to capitalize on whatever happens to be popular that week. Another lesson? Finish things. Seriously, there is an idea sitting on hard drives all over the world that never become anything because their creators convinced themselves they weren't good enough. A finished, imperfect project will teach you infinitely more than any perfect project that never leaves your imagination. Ironically, one of the biggest hurdles I've had to overcome wasn't writing or editing, it was listening to myself. When you're editing one of these videos, you're going to hear your own voice over and over and over. 20, 30, sometimes even more hours of hearing yourself speak. It's surprisingly difficult, at least for me it was. So during my first few videos, I actually used voice mod to alter my voice. Part of it was practical. It helped me distance myself from the recording just enough so I stopped hearing me every time I pressed play. Instead, I could listen to it as if it was simply another piece of the project. That little bit of separation made it much easier to critique the work without constantly critiquing myself. Looking back, I honestly think it's one of the reasons I finished those early videos at all. But there was another reason I liked it. I felt it actually fit the identity of the channel. Earlier, I talked about the veiled icon being a small representation of a much larger system. In a strange way, the altered voice felt like another veil. You weren't really hearing me, you were hearing a representation of me. But as time went on though, something changed. Not my voice, but my comfort with it. The more videos I made, the less I thought about how I sounded, and the more I thought about what I was trying to communicate. These days, I still use voice mod, it's just in a very different way. Now it's basically a clean microphone filter with a little EQ and a little polish. Just enough to make the recording sound a little nicer without having to spend extra time doing post-processing later. The voice isn't really hidden anymore, it's just cleaned up. Another thing this year's taught me is that consistency is far more reliable than motivation. Motivation is wonderful when it's there, but it comes and goes. Consistency is what carries you through those days when inspiration decides to take the afternoon off. I've also realized that every finished project quietly teaches the next one how to exist. Maybe I learn a better way to pace an argument. Maybe I discover a new editing technique. Maybe I write a joke that lands, or one that absolutely doesn't. Either way, the next video benefits from it. Practice doesn't guarantee you'll make masterpieces, it just guarantees you'll gain experience. And experience has a funny habit of compounding over time. Probably the biggest piece of advice I would give anyone thinking about creating something is to make the thing you actually want to make. And finally, don't wait until you feel ready, because you probably never will. At least I certainly didn't. If I had waited until I thought I was good enough, then the channel probably wouldn't exist. The only way I've improved over time this past year is by finishing one project, learning something, then carrying that lesson to the next. Because that's really what creating is. It's not a destination, it's a cycle. Every end teaches the next beginning. And every beginning is another chance to make something a little better than the last. When I started this channel a year ago, it wasn't because I wanted to be a YouTuber. I didn't really have a content strategy, didn't have a schedule, and I don't even really have anyone besides a handful of people who ever watch. I just had questions that I couldn't quite let go of, questions that eventually became scripts that eventually became videos, and somehow those private thought experiments became conversations. It's still a little strange to think about. An idea that starts with me sitting alone, watching a movie or reading an interview, eventually ends with people sharing their own perspective. Over the past year, I've explored simulations, monsters, superheroes, digital ownership, propaganda, found footage, creation, and countless other rabbit holes. The subjects have changed, but the process never really has. It always begins the same way: a question. A moment that doesn't quite make sense. A tiny thread that's just interesting enough to pull. Sometimes it leads nowhere. Sometimes it leads to a video. And sometimes it changes the way I think about something entirely. So, to everyone who's watched, commented, shared a video with a friend, or subscribed over the past year, thank you. Not just for watching, but for being willing to follow me down these rabbit holes. It means more than I can really put into words. If there's one thing I hope you've taken away from this little peek behind the channel, it's that these videos aren't built inside an editing program, they're built through curiosity. The editing, music, writing, they're all just ways of communicating an idea that already existed. Every video begins as a thought, a question, a curiosity. Everything you've watched over the past year started there. And every time one video is finally finished, it simply leaves room for the next question, the next investigation, the next veil waiting to be lifted. Thank you again for an incredible first year. I'm looking forward to seeing where our curiosity takes us next. Until then, catch you on the next one.